We're going to excited. We're going to let Norman introduce himself and his project.
Hi there. Can you hear me? Got my projection on. My high school theater teacher would be proud, hopefully. If not, he'd start booing from the back. My name is Norman Beer. I'm here to talk about the largest project that the Open Learning Initiative is engaged in, where we're spending most of our time for the past 4 years. It's the Community College OLI, and I'll be talking a bit about results. There's something interesting here that a lot of the work that I'll be talking about is going to be focused on measurement and numbers. And after this morning's keynote, I think there's a little bit of discomfort with that space. So it's interesting. It's something I'd like to try to address head on. Before we dive completely in, if you've ever worked with or heard about OLI in the past, you'll know that much of our work is focused on applying some of the early lessons in cognitive science and the ongoing work in learning science, coming out of Herb Simon's vision. As Herb Simon looked at the space of higher education, he really felt that there were some specific ways that we could engage to improve learning, specifically moving teaching from a solo sport to a community-based research activity. When I talk about the Open Learning Initiative, I'm talking about a community-based research activity, and this is not just the work that's happening at Carnegie Mellon University. In fact, it's work that's happening in institutions across the country and really around the world. So as much as anything else, I hope that you'll look at this as an invitation to engage and join in this community. And finally, I'd like to thank the foundations that make this work possible, not just because they're helping to provide for my paycheck, which is important to me, but actually because I think this is really a group that has put their money where their mouths are in terms of engaging with the needs of vulnerable populations, being willing to take some risks and explore what can we do to start addressing the needs of the community college space. When we talk about the Open Learning Initiative, we're actually talking about a 11-year-old project that is combining the affordances of learning science with what we know about technology, and taking a scientific and evidence-based approach to designing online learning environments, then evaluating them. Openness has been key to our project since the beginning, in part because we do believe that open access is important and sharing is key to Carnegie Mellon's agenda, but also, at a more selfish level, that to engage in authentic research, we need a large N, and opening up our materials gives us that. So we are both idealistic and practical. OLI is often seen as a technology, and I like to take a step back and note that we're not just a technology. In fact, this is an approach to the design, implementation, and improvement of learning experiences. We're designed to simultaneously engage with learning science while improving it. Obviously, technology plays a role, but we also think that it's very important that we take a team-based approach in developing these environments. Building out a course we feel is not the work of one person or one faculty member. And we believe that the capture and use of data in this work is essential. Every student engagement with a learning activity gives us a chance to evaluate how well are they achieving the learning goals. We can use this data to drive very powerful feedback loops. Many of these are inside the course, either giving feedback to the student or creating some tools to give feedback to the instructor. But we also like to use this data to improve the learning experience within individual courses and in the larger learning science community. When I talk about tools for faculty, the one that folks have been most interested in is this. This is an example of the OLI Learning Dashboard. The notion here is that every OLI course is built off of a set of student-centered, measurable learning outcomes. As the student is working through the course, we're capturing information about how well they're achieving those outcomes, and we're making a prediction based on an underlying cognitive model of their learning estimate. This is information that we're providing to a faculty member. Green are students that we expect have achieved this outcome. Yellow are still struggling. Red really aren't catching up. And so we're trying to give more information to faculty members to better inform how they spend their classroom time. As an instructor, I can really drill in here and see where are students doing well, where are they struggling, and then make best use of my classroom time to directly address student misconceptions. Our past work, as we've dug in on the evaluation side, has been pretty successful, particularly as we've looked at our statistics course. It's our longest running and oldest course. Within some of our accelerated learning work, we've seen students achieve strong learning gains as well as their traditional peers in less time. That was at Carnegie Mellon, and we've done some broader work in conjunction with Ithaca, looking at the use of these kinds of environments in larger public settings. And again, what we're seeing there is as good or better learning gain in slightly less time. All of which leads to the Community College Open Learning Initiative. So where this derives from has been a group of foundations looking at those early results and saying, it's fantastic that you can get Carnegie Mellon students to move through statistics course in a little more time, but carefully designed materials ought to help Carnegie Mellon students, right? What can you do for a larger population? Does this same approach prove as effective when we get this out in the hands of community college faculty and we get it out in front of more vulnerable student populations? The notion of the Community College Open Learning Initiative was to more closely involve community college faculty in the design, development, and implementation of the learning environments. We wanted to specifically target 4 gatekeeper courses, places with poor student success rates and high demand, develop out the courses, engage with the standard OLI process, and then get them out in front of community college students to authentically evaluate, could we make a difference in the student learning experience? What I'm going to be talking about then is this. The Community College Open Learning Initiative got started at the end of 2009, fall. I came on board OLI in the beginning of 2010, so the CC-OLI project has really dominated my time at OLI. As we talk through this project, I want to talk a little bit about the challenges that we faced at each step of the road, because I think that as much as anything else, CC-OLI has proven to be a learning experience. I want to talk briefly about the courses that we've designed and put out there in front of the world. And lastly, let's see what the evaluation results say. So, from the beginning, I think, digging into how we were going to orchestrate this approach has been a challenge. How do we identify what the right courses are? How do we build a larger network of institutions, administrators, and faculty that are willing to engage with this process? Some of this was internal challenge in terms of building a foundation, because to this point, OLI had been a relatively small team, and we needed to scale up our own efforts, even as we were reaching out to a larger population. And lastly, how do we put the processes in place both to build out these environments at scale and then evaluate them? We've had a lot of success in building these environments and evaluating them in the past. It's often been working on one course at a time. And a lot of that network that we created was internal to CMU itself. And we obviously needed to expand that network and engage with a much larger population. The first challenge was actually selecting the courses. And as you look out across the community college landscape, try to make this a little interactive, what do you look at? What are your criteria as you start picking gatekeeper courses?
Enrollment.
Enrollment, where do we see an awful lot of students?
Prerequisites, classes.
Exactly, prerequisite question. Where are courses that students need to not just move on, but to get into a lot of in-demand employment paths? Failure rates, right? We're looking at places where students just aren't doing well traditionally. But we also wanted to try to identify places where we thought we could be most effective. That, to date, there are courses where we've had more success, courses where we've had less success. We also wanted to identify places where there wasn't a lot of other work happening. There are a lot of companies out there, for example, providing map-specific education in a similar kind of approach. So we didn't want to be recreating things that were already out there. The courses that we ended up selecting were an adaptation of our existing statistics course. We've been told that there are big chunks of it that did not meet the needs of the community college space. Introduction to Psychology, one of the largest enrolled courses in community college. Huge demand for it, and students not only are walking out of these courses, well, not always walking out of those courses well, but those that do aren't always walking out with what they feel are applicable skills. And then on the life sciences side, Introduction to Biology, which actually has huge demand and huge failure rates. And finally, Anatomy and Physiology, which is required for almost every allied health course out there. In addition to these 4, we actually engaged with an English composition pilot course. We had a little bit of extra time and energy at the end of the project, but we didn't authentically engage in that, or authentically evaluate. So 4 courses, 4 years, this should be easy, right? Not so much. So when you look at the specifics of these courses, we ended up finding an awful lot of challenges here. And part of them is the sheer size of these things. When you look at A&P, this actually isn't a single course. This isn't something that's taught in one semester. And so over the course of development, what started off as Anatomy and Physiology slowly grew into Anatomy and Physiology 1 and 2, and then slowly grew into A&P 2.5, I would say. So we're really looking at almost 2 courses in development there. Introduction to biology, we started off our work looking at the existing modern bio course at CMU and doing a lot of adaptation on it, finding out that that was appropriate for a biology majors track, but it wasn't doing the job at all for an intro course. So we ended up creating essentially a second course in Intro to Bio. Psychology actually went about as planned, as did statistics. It was nice to know that the planning was getting us somewhere. As we dove into development, we've ended up, I think, being very successful in one of the goals, which was really reaching out and getting a large population of community college faculty engaged in this work. 51 faculty from 47 institutions actively participated in writing these materials, helping us understand the learning outcomes, and then improving the stuff. How many people in the room participated in this project as an author? Can I get a little bit of applause? I know that measurement isn't everything, but I am actually fairly happy to look at the sheer size of the work with which they engaged. Beyond its effectiveness, this is a very significant contribution to the commons, and I think that it's not merely static content, but very interactive and focused learning activities that target misconceptions and provide rich hints. Once we built these materials, we run into the challenge of getting it out there to the world. We had some specific goals from our funders in terms of what kind of outreach we wanted, but we really felt that getting out to as large a population as possible was important. And it turns out that that was pretty hard. I think we walked into this a little bit naive with this notion that if you build high quality, effective materials, people will show up and use them. Turns out that that's not the case. You need to do an awful lot of outreach. The second point was this distinction between use and evaluation. We walked in with this sense that anyone that was using the course, we could really get to engage deeply on the evaluation side, but it turns out that that's not the case either. There are a lot of faculty out there that are perfectly willing to adopt materials and integrate them into their classroom, but that don't have an interest in participating in a more formal set of evaluation work. Timeline to adoption. Generally speaking, when you're about to adopt a new set of materials, a textbook or an online learning environment, what I've found is that faculty tend to review these things maybe in the spring, think about reviewing it, and really engage with the materials over the summer, and then this ends up being implemented in the fall. Our development timeline did not play well with faculty needs in terms of having access to these materials and making the decision to bring this stuff into the classroom. We were putting materials out roughly every 3 to 4 months. We were putting out chunks of courses. But for a lot of faculty, they weren't willing to actually make use of these things until they had a full course and were able to really thoroughly review the materials and figure out how this was going to integrate with their local student needs. Which gets into this question of how complete are the materials and how well integrated are they with current practice, whether this is a current LMS or whether it's what the current program track is. We were fairly successful in disseminating the work, which led to another challenge. We spent a lot of time reviewing data, and pulling in our qualitative feedback was easy. The bigger the population, the better the feedback. But we also wanted to spend some time on the qualitative feedback. We wanted to take what we were hearing from faculty and embed this in our improvement efforts. Doing that at scale is actually a lot harder than we planned for. And the last thing that caused some real challenges is that straight in the middle of our project, suddenly it was declared the year of the MOOC, and this ended up sucking an awful lot of oxygen out of the room. I actually think we probably would have done better to simply claim these were MOOCs, and would have had more folks interested in making use of them in their class. But that ended up changing the dialogue and really giving us some challenges in how we engaged with the materials. Nonetheless, I think that we've been exceptionally successful in exposing more students to these materials. What you're looking at here are the last 2 years of work, use of OLI. It's worth noting the difference in these categories. Academic use are students that are enrolled in some kind of classroom setting. This is an instructor that has created a course. Open and free enrolled is a student that has created an account, but they're an independent learner out there in the world who wants to track their own work. Finally, we allow anonymous users to just jump in and start making use of the course. You don't need to create an account. And so, in addition to the stats project, we engaged with the Carnegie Foundation for the advancement of teaching on their Statway project. It's a close relationship between those materials. Last thing that's interesting, after building out the psychology course, it turned out that there was an opportunity to pair this learning environment with a MOOC offering that was coming out of Georgia Tech. And so I've also thrown on the MOOC numbers there, which really changed the dynamic in terms of what kind of information we were getting back from students. On with the evaluation components. As I've already mentioned, a lot of these, simply recruiting folks into the evaluation project was a challenge. We ended up having stipends available for faculty that got involved, and the stipends sat at different levels if folks were adopting these new materials or if they were simply serving as a control for us, teaching the way that they normally would, but administering the evaluation work. In hindsight, we ended up creating an incentive structure that really drove folks towards using the materials and not helping out on the control side. Part of that was financial, although frankly the stipends were not enormous. But what we also discovered is that once faculty were exposed to these materials, they didn't want to serve in the control population anymore. So this is good stuff. I want to show this to my students. Getting protocols in place both for the administration of the evaluation work and for IRB approval was a challenge, particularly when you start reaching out across multiple community colleges. We weren't just juggling CMU's IRB. We also needed protocols in place for every institution with which we engaged. IRBs are not a good time in any circumstance, but it turns out that many community colleges don't have as formal a set of protocols in place for things like student consent. And so we were often helping folks make this up as we went. And it created its own set of challenges, and it also created some discrepancies in what kind of information we were able to get. Lastly, there was a question of assessment instruments. How were we going to measure learning gain? We felt pretty strongly that it was unfair to simply use the internal course assessments as a measure for learning gain. And so we explicitly looked outside for third-party assessment instruments that were well regarded. For anatomy and physiology, we used the Human Anatomy and Physiology exam and got a selection of questions from that. For biology, A&P, we actually were able to get permission from the College Board to use a selection of questions from the AP exams. And lastly, on stats, we used the chaos test. So we felt that we had a reasonable set of instruments that were well regarded in terms of assessing these skill sets, but these instruments were not effectively paired with what was being taught in the course. And so this created its own set of challenges. As we started moving out, we started to see some differences in how faculty implemented these materials, which I think was fairly appropriate. We were trying not to be prescriptive in how faculty made use of the materials, but it also makes evaluating it a challenge. We saw some real inconsistencies in how assessment was administered. In some cases, faculty were making it voluntary. In some cases, they were incorporating these as part of the final grade. And this dramatically changed student motivations. The course release cycles ended up creating a challenge in as much as we were continuously improving and expanding on the courses. OLI's system is very effective at capturing data, but there was a question of what data we wanted to use for this evaluation. In some ways it was drowning in a sea of opportunity. And lastly, having an adequate control size has been a serious challenge. It turns out that much of what we thought was an adequate control size ended up not being useful when we started running the numbers, either because exams weren't administered or in at least one case with our psychology course, because the faculty members started pointing students to the OLI system and having them use the materials. Study design I'm going to skip over. In the end, when we were really driving in, what we were trying to understand were the differences between the faculty and students who were making use of this course. What were their characteristics? Were there differences in achievement gain between OLI and non-OLI students? And finally, how were these materials used both in the classroom and by students, and what were the differences? What do we think of as good practice? This is my favorite slide in the deck, and my lead researcher tells me that I need to stop being so proud of it. I think this actually gets back to this question earlier today in the keynote of what are we measuring and how do we trust it? So first, we did in fact see significant gains in learning as measured by the final test between the OLI and non-OLI populations across the courses. My lead researcher now forces me to say very honestly that I cannot tell you that this is directly attributable to the OLI materials because of the dramatic differences between students, implementation, and faculty. So to really be honest about this, we need to take a deeper dive and see what we can say about these distinctions. So first, what we learned about OLI versus non-OLI students, we actually had a much higher population of Hispanic students. The non-OLI students tended to be younger. Their pre- and post-test scores were not as good. And our OLI students tended to spend more time on task. They claimed a greater comfort with and a desire for using online assets. And they had higher expectations. They expected to do better in the class than their non-OLI peers. Obviously, all of these things are going to have an impact on performance. So when we really tried to drill in on what represents the OLI effect, we ended up with a mixed bag, in part because of some of these control challenges that I talked about in the past. When we use running out of time here. So our first model was a propensity score matching, and when we dig in here, this is probably our most robust model, but unfortunately our control was so small that we didn't feel like we could achieve significance on this. We did see an OLI effect in this case, but not a significant one. Some of our less robust models were also showing a gain, but it's not a gain that we were as excited by. So advice for future educational research really is to drill in and take care of your control population in ways that was cleaner than we did. This question, the second question that we dove into then was, does use make a difference? We're trying to understand effective and ineffective student use, effective and ineffective faculty use. What we found there was that use does make a huge difference. We see a positive relationship with how faculty use the system. This influences how students use the system, and this is the place where we do see learning gains. I just got my 1 minute flag, so I'm going to move through these quickly. Faculty influences student use. Student use does relate to gains. And in terms of how faculty use this, we saw an enormous impact in terms of how they were using the system, what kind of prior experience they had, both in teaching and using OLI, and in how they integrated this into their practice. In the end, what we can determine is that there's an impact on achievement, but more work to be done. We did do some good work in leveling out student characteristics, where we would have expected a difference and didn't see one. Preparation time, giving faculty adequate support for engaging in this work, and finally, we learned an awful lot about large-scale evaluation. I know that there's been a lot of question as to what's next for the Open Learning Initiative, so a couple of things over the summer that have been pretty interesting. One, an awful lot of the production, hosting, and support work that's been happening at OLI is being moved out to a company called Acrobatic. This is going to allow us at Carnegie Mellon to continue our focus on research and really refocus our efforts in that space, I think. At the same time, our director, Candace Sill, has headed to Stanford University, and so we're now really looking at a real model for that larger community-based research activity. And now includes not just CMU, but Stanford. Much of the work at Stanford is going to be focusing on building out the Open edX platform so that we have some additional options out there for running OLI courses and providing OLI-like functionality. Last point, a huge population of folks contributed to this work, both in the development of these courses, the improvement and implementation, their evaluation, and performing outreach for us to get faculty involved. And so I really like to acknowledge them. The past 4 years have been an awful lot of work. I think mostly they've done good work there. Thank you very much.